We have the pleasure of a presentation tonight by Laura Heedy on a habitat connectivity pilot project that a number of people have been involved in, and Brenda, maybe I'll ask you to talk a little bit about that. This topic, if you will, you can more immediately involved in the rest of us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, Red Hook was the lucky recipient of to be named as the focus of a study that was funded by the Hudson River Estuary Program. And the purpose of the study was to look at the mapping of our habitat, our natural habitats in the town, using a Cornell model, and to come up using a stakeholder group to come up with tools for preserving this habitat. And this is to preserve habitat connectivity so that our community will be resilient, and also in preparation for climate change. So tonight, Laura Heedy from the Hudson River Estuary Program and Ted Fink from Green Plan, who was one of the technical supports for the project, are here to discuss the results and talk about the recommendations for the future to preserve these areas.
Great. Thank you, Brenda. Brenda was such a good stakeholder. I feel like you could have just given the presentation that I'm going to give. Before I begin, let's see, I did bring a couple of things to hand out. I'll just do this now so I don't interrupt the talk. Now, Brenda, did everybody get a copy of the report from AKRF? I know you took
It was made available through
Okay.
It was in the clerk's office.
I still have some copies there.
Great. So I'm going to just give you two materials from our program just to refer to afterwards. One is our very new State of the Hudson, which is a snapshot of how we've been doing with all the work we've been doing in the Hudson River Estuary watershed. We renew our action agenda every 5 years, and we've just closed public comment on the action agenda. But this is kind of a look back at how we did the last 5 years. And I'm also giving you a handout on what myself and my colleague at the Estuary Program do for communities with regard to helping conserve nature and habitat, because there's some websites and resources on there that might be useful. I have a couple copies if anybody from the audience wants any. So, hi. I'm going to take you pass. Okay, and then I also have a couple of State of the Hudsons, which I can leave up here. Okay. Now, can everybody see this okay? I can maybe make the slides a little larger.
Jim, I want you to lower the light there above that, please.
Should we turn? Just so that I can see you all. A water bottle. Whoa. There we go. This is like a smart projector. It does a lot of stuff on its own. I don't use that. Okay, so we're going to have to just advance on here.
You know what? I can.
No, I think
I normally use one, and that would be great.
You want it like this, Joe?
no, I think it's too dark, Jim. That's better. I think it's
Pop that in. Yep. I'll do that.
follow.
And then it should register right away.
And I can just hold it in my hand?
Yeah.
All right, good.
You should be. You shouldn't have to put it on there. It
might take a moment.
Might take
Okay.
a moment just to.
All right, so I'll just go ahead and get started while we wait. So I'm Laura Heedy, and as Brenda said, I work at the Hudson River Estuary Program through a partnership with Cornell University. And I'm excited to talk to you and together with Ted Fink, talk about the program, the pilot projects that we worked on together with Red Hook, the town, as well as the village and the village of Tivoli. And I didn't look back in my notes, but do you recall when we started? It was a very fast-paced project because it was
in the fall, was it September?
It was about 4 or 5 months that we were really going to engage the stakeholder group, get the results of the Cornell model, and then leave it really up to the stakeholder group to come up with some recommendations. So I'm going to give an overview of that process and some of the results of the model. Okay. Right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'll give a little project overview. I'm going to talk about connectivity, just because I know that it's not necessarily a term that comes up at town board meetings all the time, and just make sure we're all on the same page with understanding connectivity, and talk about the computer models that my Cornell colleagues developed, Jason Martin, and with some assistance from Suzanne Weiler. And then we're going to look at the recommendations that the stakeholder group came up with regard to those models, and then Ted's going to talk about some of the opportunities for implementing those recommendations in the town of Red Hook. And then we've left time for some Q&A and discussion. So for those of you not familiar with the Hudson River Estuary Program, we are a program within the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, but we're unique in that we don't kind of confine our activities to Region 3, which is based out of New Paltz. We also work up in Region 4 because we take an ecosystem-based approach. So we're working throughout the watershed, which is delineated by this green line on the map. And here you have New York City and the estuary portion of the Hudson River, which is tidal all the way up to the Troy Dam up near Albany. And so that green delineated area is the watershed of the Hudson River, and we're working throughout that area. And we work primarily, at least my team in particular, with municipalities, because we recognize that if we're concerned about water quality, if we're concerned about stream quality, and the forests, for example, in the estuary watershed that directly affect water that's flowing into the estuary itself, we really need to engage with the people who are making decisions about land use every day. So we work a lot with municipal planning boards, CACs like you have here in Red Hook, as well as county agencies. But we also partner with land trusts and other organizations. And we have 6 key benefits that we're working toward, which you can imagine, many of them really connect to this idea of connectivity. We want a vital estuary ecosystem that can support the signature fisheries of the Hudson River. We're working toward clean water, resiliency in the communities along the Hudson River, like Red Hook, but as well as those that are more in the watershed. We're also working toward conservation of fish, wildlife, and habitat, and of course, habitat connectivity is such a key part of that. Preservation of the beautiful natural scenery of the river, and finally, just providing enhanced opportunity for people to get out and enjoy the Hudson River, have access where possible, including universal access, and also just to be able to be inspired and enjoy and recreate in the river. So that's kind of the overview of what we're all about, and that State of the Hudson report that I gave you kind of gives us a check-in on how we've been doing on this mission in the last 5 years. So when we work with communities or landowners or conservation organizations, the approach we're always encouraging is very simple. When it comes to conservation, whatever scale you're working at, whether it be a site plan at a planning board meeting, whether it's thinking about an open space plan like you have here in Red Hook, or whether it's thinking about regional connectivity or regional conservation throughout a huge watershed, you always need to start out with identifying what it is that you have. It's hard to set priorities without first knowing what it is that you have and that you value. So we always start there, just identify what you have. And Red Hook has done so much of that already with all of the various inventories and like agricultural inventories, for example, with your ag lands. And I know that the CAC is starting to map some wetlands, which is wonderful. So those are all pieces that are going to enable Red Hook to continue updating and changing its priorities. And then ultimately, you use those priorities to develop plans for protecting and managing those resources you value. And I often use the analogy, it's like an insurance policy, right? When you want to insure what's important to you, you need to think about what are the resources that I most value, which ones am I going to prioritize, and how am I going to best ensure that I'm going to have them in the future. And that's what we do when it comes to land use planning and conservation planning. So at the estuary program, we're thinking regionally. It's 10 counties that are in the watershed roughly. And so we're thinking about our priorities include the estuary shoreline, the wetlands and forests that are in the watershed, and the wetlands that are also along the shoreline, or tidal wetlands, as well as stream corridors, streams, floodplains, the banks of the streams. These are some of our key habitat priorities in the watershed. And of course, Red Hook has all of these, and as do all the communities in the Hudson estuary watershed. Let me just back up. Let's see here. But the other piece of this that's so important is we can't just conserve these discrete ecological features. They have no value if they're isolated and disconnected. Just like our transportation systems will fail if they're not connected. Our electric systems, our utilities will fail if they're not connected. Nature operates the same way. And in order for natural systems to function as well as for wildlife to be able to move around and so forth, we need connectivity between these different elements of the ecosystem. And I try to encourage the idea of thinking broadly about connectivity. A lot of times people think about the classic wildlife corridor. And a corridor like out here in the hall is a very straight, narrow corridor. And that model in nature doesn't work. Nature doesn't necessarily move in straight lines. from point A to point B, for example. So we need to maintain broad connectivity. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of the ways we define connectivity. First, though, I want to have you just think about why is connectivity important. Well, for starters, it enables wildlife as well as plant communities to shift and to move across the landscape if it's connected. If there's, I just saw actually the Clarkstown Police Department put up a Facebook post about being careful about snapping turtles crossing Kings Highway down Rockland County, because this is the time of year they're moving to nest. And they're aware that there are so many turtles crossing the road that it becomes a hazard for the turtles as well as drivers trying to pass, and so they are encouraging everybody to drive slower. And that's a perfect, very local example of what happens when connectivity in wildlife habitat is severed. And there's all different scales of connectivity, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But even temporally, connectivity has different values. There's just daily movements of animals that need to get from maybe the place they feed to the place that they rest overnight. There are seasonal movements, and turtle nesting this time of year is a great example of that. I always think of Memorial Day weekend as the time when painted turtles, snapping turtles, in parts of Dutchess County, Blandings turtles, that's when they start moving. In the spring we have our salamander migrations, which Red Hook volunteers have been involved in. So there's seasonal movements as well that necessitate the movement of animals. But there's also things like dispersal of young, right? So hundreds if not thousands of salamander and frog juveniles come out of a vernal pool, they all need to move and get out and create their own kind of home range. And that's true for animals that are wider ranging, like mammals. And so they need to be able to move across the landscape. But then there's longer range movements that are going to be a result of climate change, and we're already seeing that. And that's where rising temperatures are causing animals to need to shift their ranges to higher elevations or further northward because the temperatures are cooler there. And a great example is our Carolina wren, which over the last decades has actually been expanding its range northward because our winters have become more mild. Although that's hard to believe after the last 2 winters that we've had here in the Hudson Valley. But we are seeing over that longer range time, there's a real need to have a landscape that isn't all fragmented and that isn't full of barriers, so there can be these shifts, both over the long term as well as the more localized movements of wildlife. But there's also ecological processes that need to occur, and that can occur when our landscapes are intact and are connected. Things like gene flow. We don't have isolated populations, and those populations can exchange with one another. There's gene flow. Similarly, things as simple as seed dispersal or plant communities being able to shift. Plants are not like animals. They're not going to just walk or hop, but they need to shift as well with changing climate, as well as just localized environmental changes. And also, natural disturbance is actually a favorable ecological process. Things like flooding, things like blowdowns in forests and so forth. All those disturbances are important for maintaining ecosystems. And finally, when you have large intact habitats and large intact natural areas, resilience is greater, whether it be an ecosystem resilience, the ability of an ecosystem, for example, a large forest to be invaded by emerald ash borer or Asian longhorn beetle or some kind of invasive species that does damage. If that's a large, intact, healthy forest with a lot of diversity of trees, it can probably rebound from that kind of disturbance more resiliently than it could if it was a small, fragmented, disturbed habitat. And similarly, our human communities benefit from large intact habitat and large intact natural areas. Flooding is a great example. When we have broad floodplains without development that enable the stream to connect to the surrounding uplands, we're more resilient to those sorts of disturbances from storms. So there's just a few examples, and I obviously could talk about this for a long time, but I'm trying to keep it short. But I wanted to talk about the different kinds of connectivity. And I'm not going to get too into the technical aspects of the model because they are quite technical, and if anybody's interested in that level of detail, I'd be happy to share Jason Martin and the other authors' report on the computer model. But to just give you an idea of the way they approach the model, there's two ways of thinking about connectivity: functional and structural. Structural connectivity just has to do with the actual physical characteristics of a landscape. Things like the topography, the hydrology, the vegetative cover. How does one forest relate to another? How do things touch on the landscape? Very physical, very basic, structural kind of concept. The other is more important. Functional connectivity actually describes within that landscape how well do genes, seeds, plant propagules, individual animals or populations that move through the landscape. So has that structural connectivity enabled it to actually function? So those are two ways of thinking about it. And if you want to understand functional connectivity, it really takes a much more in-depth project. For example, putting radio transmitters on animals and seeing how do they actually move? Are they able to move across the landscape? That scale of that kind of work is beyond what we're doing. But what we're interested in really is looking at landscapes and maintaining large intact systems, because we know that the resilience for, like I said, wildlife, plant populations as well as human populations will benefit. Here's kind of a graphic to help explain this. So let's see, is there a laser pointer? Ooh, whoa, sorry. There we go. There's no laser pointer.
No,
No, okay. So on the left here we have a very simple schematic of two forests, large forest patches in either corner, with a very simple corridor providing structural connectivity. So structurally, there's a little band of forest between two large forest areas. Something like a wood thrush, like in the photo on the left, that wood thrush may find that to be quite functional because the bird can fly from one large patch to another, and it's not necessarily going to be limited by the constraints of a small, narrow forested corridor. A species like the spotted salamander, however, may not be able to move across the landscape in that little minimal corridor. Perhaps there's a huge rock outcrop in the middle of that forested strip, and it can't go that way. So it might try to move from one forested patch to another where it lives, through that field, and it would become dried out, desiccated from the sun exposure, not enough moisture, and so forth. So there's not necessarily functional connectivity when there's structural connectivity. So that's why we really need to think strategically about what is it we're trying to accomplish. In this example here, we have two forest patches, but we have some broad connectivity that actually contains its own habitat value. In this case, we can say that's a vernal pool, for example, in this connection between these two places. And that's something to keep in mind when we talk about linkages between natural areas or linkages between habitats. They can have habitat value of their own. We're not saying that we've highlighted all the most important places and we're trying to connect them. Those connecting areas also have habitat value. So anyway, so that's kind of a little basics on functional versus structural connectivity. And the obvious threats to maintaining that kind of connectivity are things like habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, and habitat degradation. And in the Hudson Valley, the trend we've seen over decades is the primary threat to connectivity is the patterns of development that we've seen, where we see more sprawl-like development. Red Hook has been so great in pursuing concepts like the Centers and Green Spaces plan, where you're focusing development in the center and maintaining connected green spaces. And we're hoping that you'll integrate more wildlife habitat into that thinking, along with some of the other resources that have been prioritized in that approach. So all that leads up to this idea that the Hudson River Estuary Program wanted to pilot a project to see, could we take some of these models that Cornell was developing for the entire Hudson River Estuary watershed and looking at where do we have regional connectivity and scale it down to something that would be useful for our municipal partners, the ones who are making decisions at the planning board level, at the open space planning level, and so forth. And so the process was going to involve identifying important ecological features, considering community priorities. Obviously, this is one piece of the puzzle. We know that every community has their own sets of priorities and lots of plans that are already in place. And so part of this process was to engage planners in reviewing the existing documents that the municipality had. And then finally, the stakeholder group is going to work with the planners to develop a framework of conservation strategies, in this case for the town of Red Hook, and then to implement recommendations. And here we have one of our evenings with the stakeholder group in the Tivoli Town Hall, or Tivoli Library, above the Tivoli Library. And so again, this reflects back to that idea. We're going through this process of identifying what do we have in these communities that are important for connectivity. The stakeholder group, working with the planners, were able to look at what you already have in terms of existing policies and start setting priorities, and then we can move forward from there in talking tonight about some of the recommendations for implementation. So here are some of the outputs from the actual Cornell model. On the left, we see the regional scale model, which was a very coarse scale look at taking the largest regional forest priorities. So these were things like the Catskills, the Hudson Highlands, the Rensselaer Plateau, places like that that have regional significance. And using computer models to find where were the highest quality and least effort kind of linkages between those. And this is across a regional scale. So I've shown you what that looks like on the Red Hook map here, but this was not intended to scale down to the municipal level. What we see here, if I step across, this orange area here in Red Hook reflects these linkages that are showing up here in northern Dutchess County. So what that's telling us is Red Hook has some area in it that's valuable for these regional connectivity concepts. However, the scale of that model was not intended to be able to say, okay, well that means we need to work on those 2 corridors right there. That really was done with data that was much coarser than what we would need for local scale planning. So Jason Martin, who is a postdoctorate at Cornell that worked with us, he took a model and he finessed it to try to take better data and also to consider the values of Red Hook and the input from the stakeholder group, which helped us understand about the importance of agriculture, for example. And so one of the adjustments he was able to make at the more local level, to give you an example, is any farmland that was adjacent to forests and therefore kind of helped buffer forests from development was given a higher ranking when it was put into this model matrix. And it's very technical, and I don't want to bore you with all the details tonight since we have limited time. But in general, this model was used finer scale data, and it looked at major forest patches primarily. And you see there's a lot of good intact habitat on the west and the east sides of Red Hook. And then it developed a series of linkages. And I have another slide here that kind of shows a little bit more of the detail. And what this local scale model did was it emphasized interior forests, meaning forests that are in larger patches that don't have a lot of edge to them, because we know that edge habitat has a lot of negative ecological characteristics. More predation, a lot of invasive species, more disturbance. So this model emphasized connecting things like interior forests, forested riparian areas, those stream corridors that are forested, as well as forested wetlands. Those were some of the key places that were being connected by this model. And also the linkage areas also had a lot of forest in them. And what we saw, and what Jason Martin and the other authors documented is, as you can see, there were a number of places where there were east-west linkages to, kind of connecting those larger contiguous areas on the west side and east side of Red Hook. However, they're very narrow and tenuous, right? So there was the recommended strategy that perhaps looking at some of those and determining are there opportunities to restore them to increase some of the broadness of those connections, that might be one way to go. Because the good news was, the report that was done by the planners, AKRF and Green Plan, that worked on this project with us and kind of helped us biologists with the planning side of things, that report pointed out that a lot of the linkage network, which is shown here in purple, actually is protected in some way or another. There's different levels of protection, but that it captured a lot of the linkages. So one of the other strategies would be to identify where there are gaps in protection, or maybe the protection is rather light and you might want to strengthen that protection for long term. And one other thing I'll point out to you on the map is the green area reflects that regional linkage I showed you on the earlier map. And that separate model that was looking at the more local scale connections, of course, showed there was quite a bit of overlap with the local level resources in those more regional. So the stakeholder group kind of batted around, well, what does this mean? Originally, we were looking to have a parcel-based kind of approach developed where there was recognition of certain parcels that might be key for protection, but instead they took a different kind of planning approach, which was great, and Ted's going to talk more about that. But it kind of recognized that there were already so many plans and policies in place in Red Hook, there might be ways to use existing tools rather than creating new ones. So I'm going to just briefly go over the stakeholder recommendations and then pass it over to you.
Just go over it, because I'm going to be going through the same thing, basically. When you've got the recommended...
I just have them outlined here.
Okay, yeah, and I'm going to go through each one.
Okay, so maybe I'll just do a very fast overview.
Yeah, sure.
And then
just do an overview.
Okay, so there were short-term, mid-term, and long-term actions identified by the stakeholder group. The most short-term included mapping areas of concern as critical environmental areas. And I'm going to go through these quickly since Ted will cover them. Midterm actions looked more at taking existing zoning, existing subdivision regulations, and going through and finding where there are opportunities to maybe amend them slightly to embrace and enhance this connectivity concept a little bit more. And also looking at the community preservation program plan, which I believe is going to be updated soon, and there's opportunity to maybe increase some of the wildlife criteria there. And then there were long-term and ongoing actions that were suggested by the stakeholder group. Everything from doing some more habitat studies and habitat mapping, working with partners like Bard College and Hudsonia, to things like adopting a biodiversity overlay district, maintaining a database of every development project often has a habitat assessment or a wetland delineation. There's all this great data out there, but it's often in a binder somewhere in a planning office or a planning board's house, for example. I know that happened for me. So they suggested maybe getting a database of all that information so that it would be readily available for future reference. Even just increasing awareness, maybe at the planning board level, of the importance of ecological connectivity and how planning decisions can be made differently to make sure we maintain that connectivity. There was some talk about looking at the forestry management plan and the timber harvesting provisions, and also with respect to forestry, there are 3 large forested areas identified in the open space plan for the town, and the recommendation was to avoid further fragmentation of those large forested areas. Using mapping to identify kind of where there are pinch points in that linkage network system, as well as where mitigation could be used to kind of minimize the effects of planning projects such as road development and where roads might be fragmenting habitat. Ted's going to talk about all these more, and I wanted to just thank the communities, the town of Red Hook and the village of Red Hook and the village of Tivoli for participating. These are some of the volunteers from Red Hook that have been involved in programs that we either funded or implemented ourselves over the years, everything from habitat mapping. The first time, which was way back when, I was involved in teaching that group, and then more recently Red Hook did another biodiversity assessment training with Hudsonia that we funded, and then we had our stakeholder group. And I know that everybody who volunteers for programs like this volunteer for many other programs, so I just wanted to thank everybody who was involved in this. We really appreciated the participation. And what we're looking forward to doing is using Red Hook and this project then as a case study that we'll share with other communities to show, look at all the great stuff happening in Red Hook. This is one more project that's happened there, and you can do something similar in your community. So we're looking forward to implementation, which I'm going to switch it over and let you talk about some of those opportunities and for implementation, and then I'll be here during the Q&A obviously as well. Any questions while I just load up Ted's slides? Okay.
Since it was a pilot
Yes.
study, were you surprised by anything? I mean, what did you learn? I mean, this is the whole point of it, right?
Right. Well, so one thing we learned was, which we expected, having knowledgeable and engaged stakeholders was really key, because we come in with the biological concepts and we can read the comprehensive plan, we can look at some of the online plans and so forth, but understanding the history, what's happened over the years, what the culture and the current thinking is of the community is really important. Having local planners like Ted and Michelle who knew the code really well, that was really invaluable, and we wouldn't expect to do a project like this, without that kind of partnership. Another kind of take-home message for us was, this was a really expedited process, and Red Hook and Tivoli were, and the village of Red Hook were all willing communities ready to, jump in. Not all communities are there, so we were trying to think, well, how would we work on a process like this in a community that maybe was a little bit farther back in their planning? And one take-home message there was, perhaps plugging in when the town or village is going through an open space planning process, for example. Then there's a door open, they're thinking about landscape, town level. That would be a good time to bring this project in. And also kind of learning about the model. I mean, there's some lessons learned by my Cornell colleagues too that we're still working out and thinking, because the other thing, it's a very complicated process, the model, and it's not just a static map. So there's different ways that they could tweak the model to have different outputs, and that's not necessarily clearly understandable to a planning board, for example. So we're trying to figure out ways to help this dynamic tool be recognized for what it is and what it isn't. So we're still learning about it, and we'll see how things go, because the next, obviously, goal is getting some of the recommendations implemented so that we can see whether the project has, legs and keeps going, and we see connectivity preserved. So.
Okay, great, thanks, Laura.
Sure.
Okay, I'd like to start off just by telling you a little bit about the thinking behind the whole project and how it works, what the next steps are in order to bring this thing forward. And one of the very first things you should be aware of is that the actions that are recommended in this document, what they do is they incorporate consideration of ecological connectivity and the town code in a number of different locations. Laura mentioned zoning, she mentioned subdivision regulations, but there's also the community preservation plan as well. So those would all be amended if this thing goes forward to consider the kinds of concepts, the structural, the functional connectivity that she talked about, so that those can get incorporated right into the code. One thing I think you need to be aware of is that the kinds of actions that are recommended are not going to have any sort of an effect on density or on land uses or anything that would be potentially hotly contested, like those kind of things. These are softer sorts of approaches because, Laura, I think, talked a lot about how well the town's code is already situated for this kind of an approach. And so really the first one, the short-term action that she talked about, seeker regulations, the seeker statute, what it does is it encourages agencies to identify areas within their jurisdiction that have either exceptional or unique environmental characteristics. And this has been interpreted by municipalities in a wide variety of different ways. Dutchess County, for instance, had designated hazardous waste sites as critical environmental areas within the county. But that's sort of unusual. But what most communities do is they have a particularly important view shed, a scenic view, or they have a special area that has endangered species habitat, or they have a very unique natural community that they want to designate as a critical environmental area. And so one of the things that SEEKR does is it allows for the designation of these CEAs. It can be done by any state or local agency, meaning that either the town board can designate a CEA or the planning board on its own could designate a CEA. Even the zoning board, I mean, that's kind of a stretch, but any agency that has jurisdiction under SEEKR to review applications, to review actions, also has the ability to be able to undertake the designation of a critical environmental area. And these areas, they have to be mapped. This is actually an area that is shown on a map. It has to have supporting documentation as to why this area qualifies as an exceptional or a unique area. There has to be a public hearing, and there has to be notification to New York State DEC. There has to be notification to all other agencies like the county DPW, the DOT, the DEC, and so forth. They all have to be notified of the designation of a critical environmental area. And so once they're designated, once they're designated, okay, that's what I just said, so I'm going to go right on to the next one. Once they're designated, you see the problem you're having with this thing? It's very, very touchy. This is the kind of thing that a CEA produces. It's a very simple question on the environmental assessment form. Critical environmental area doesn't mean that there's all of a sudden a new designation that has any inherent protection. It's a question on the environmental assessment form as part of the review of any action, whether it's an action that's going to be funded or approved by an agency. And that includes not only the town, but also any other agency that does business in the town of Red Hook. Once a CEA is designated, they also have to look to the environmental assessment form. And this is taken directly from the short form. These are the new forms that became effective in October 2013. And in the short form, it asks a simple question. Will the proposed action have an impact on the environmental characteristics that cause the establishment of a critical environmental area? And the question is no, or small impact may occur, or moderate to large impact may occur. If it's a moderate to large impact, then the next step would be to prepare a narrative describing what that impact is and what mitigation might be available to reduce or modify that environmental impact. So that's the kind of assessment that would be in addition to what the planning board or the town board already does every day. It's simply answering one additional question on the environmental assessment form. Now it's the short form. Gets a little bit more complicated with the long form. And as you're probably aware, in the town, you have a lot of areas that are going to be designated Type 1 action because they're part of a historic district. For instance, the Hudson River National Historic Landmark District. Anything within that area is automatically a Type 1 action. And so for a Type 1 action, you have to use the full or the long environmental assessment form. So in this case, the question is, impact on critical environmental areas. The proposed action may be located within or adjacent to a critical environmental area. All right, and that's a yes or a no. So if you're within the critical environmental area, the answer is yes. But then the assessment part of it comes into play. The proposed action may result in a reduction in the quantity of the resource or characteristic, which was the basis for designation of CEA. And then the second question is, the proposed action may result in a reduction in the quality of the resource or characteristic, which was the basis for designation of CEA. So again, you check the box small to moderate impact, or no or small impact, or moderate to large impact may occur. So that's the basis for critical environmental areas in the town. It's a relatively straightforward process. It's probably the main reason why this was designated as a short-term action, because it can be done relatively simply. The report that was prepared, Planning for Resilient Natural Communities, this is the kind of report that would become adopted as part of a critical environmental area. You would have to do some mapping work, but there's already detailed mapping in here that identifies these areas from the Cornell model. So much of the work has already been done in order to designate a critical environmental area. The town decided it wanted to go forward with that as the very first action on this. So relatively simple. The next ones are designated midterm actions. These are not quite as simple because they involve zoning changes or amendments to the town subdivision regulations, both of which were adopted by local law, and both of which, if there were to be any changes made to them, there is a long, rigorous process that you have to go through in order to amend the zoning and subdivision regulations. Public hearings and public notice and notification to adjacent municipalities and review by the county planning department and things of that nature all go into it. And so the four primary recommendations for amending the zoning is the section that deals with development near water bodies, development or other types of activities that occur within stream corridors, conservation subdivisions, which was part of the whole package that was adopted in 2011, and then the AB district, what are called residential siting standards, which were incorporated into the AB district development review process. So those are the four recommendations for making potential changes to the town zoning law. As far as the subdivision regulations are concerned, this is a little bit more straightforward. One would be to amend the resource analysis map process, and I'll get into that in just a moment, and to also the conservation subdivision supplemental plat requirements in terms of what additional documentation would need to be provided as part of a review of the subdivision within the town. So, to get into the first one, development near water bodies, this is in the zoning, section 143-30. Today, there is a special use permit required within anything, any development activity that occurs within 100 feet of state classified stream, 1,000 feet of the Hudson River, and 100 feet of state protected wetlands. This is what you already have in your zoning today. So what I've put in here is a suggestion, and this would directly address the recommendation from the report about amending how the planning board considers the factors as part of their approval of a special use permit to include ecological connectivity. That was going back to what I said first, the consideration. It doesn't say that you must set aside ecological connectivity. You must consider it, though, as part of the review process, okay? So that would be for development near water, and it would only apply to these three areas: your state classified streams, the Hudson River, and a state protected freshwater wetland, okay? So that's the first one. Second one is your section of the code that deals with stream corridors. This is section 143-47B1. And what this is the Environmental Protection Overlay District. And this also requires a special use permit for development activities, but also for other things such as tree clearing, grading activities, application of pesticides or herbicides that are not done in accordance with the recommendations of the Department of Ag and Markets. And this is also in there, the dumping or disposal activities near the named streams. And there are specific streams like the Sawkill and Waterkill and so forth that are all included in the actual special permit requirements. So again, what would be done in this section of the zoning to amend it would simply be to add ecological connectivity as an environmental resource for protection within the EPO district. Okay, so again, this is the kind of thing that would apply only to the Environmental Protection Overlay District, okay, for stream corridors. The next one, this would be your newly amended section 143-33 for conservation subdivision. And there are two sections within conservation subdivisions that would apply. One would be the actual purposes of a conservation subdivision. So make clear that ecological connectivity would be one of the purposes of the planning board having the authority to mandate a conservation subdivision if they so wish. Planning board has the authority to do that when a parcel of land has certain ecological characteristics today. And so the suggestion here would be to add ecological connectivity as it's defined in this report as one of the reasons why you would have a conservation subdivision. And so again, that would go as for ecological connectivity. This would be one of the features for your conservation subdivisions. Okay. The next thing has to do, and this again is part of the AV district that was created just 4 years ago, 143-39-1G. And what the AV district has is when there's residential development that occurs within the AV district, that is residential development. There are certain siting standards that are designed to try and keep houses, roads, driveways, and those sorts of things off of prime farmland soils, the areas that are really important to protect from a farming standpoint. And as you all know, this is the agricultural business zoning district. So what this would do would be to add a statement to minimize the impact on ecological connectivity when homes, septic systems, roads, driveways, and so forth are planned within the AV district. Okay? The next one, and this is part of your subdivision regulations, the resource analysis map. This is section 120-23, and this is now part of the subdivision review process, is that applicants, just like Laura said, you know, one of the very first things is to identify what you have. That's what a resource analysis map does. It requires, as part of the review process, to have all of the resources of significance on a property that is proposed for subdivision to be identified. And so within the town, all major subdivisions require a resource analysis map. The planning board does also have some authority to be able to require a resource analysis map on a minor subdivision if there is due cause for them to do so. And so what would be amended here would be to simply add your ecological connectivity areas to the list of natural features that would be shown on the sketch plan drawing. And so this is the drawing that the planning board uses when they're identifying the primary and the secondary conservation areas on a parcel that is about to be subdivided, so that these areas, your primary conservation areas, are primarily those areas that can't be built anyway. They're your extremely steep slopes, they're your wetlands, they're your stream corridors and things like that. Your secondary conservation areas are areas that have conservation value, and so they're viewed on a case-by-case basis as part of the development review process. And this is what I was just talking about, the delineation of your natural and cultural features through the four-step design process. And so what you would do would be to include ecological connectivity as a special feature of the secondary conservation area. So it's really very simple. It involves simply amending the language of that to include ecological connectivity as one of those things that is factored into the planning for a subdivision within the town. So that's pretty much it as far as the recommendations for the midterm actions are concerned on the zoning and subdivision regulations. But the other midterm action is your community preservation plan. When the state law was passed that created the community preservation plan process for the town, it requires an update every 5 years. And your CPP was adopted in 2011, so you're just about due to have an update to your community preservation plan. One of the things which was reviewed as part of the community preservation plan of those areas that would be deemed to be worthy to be recipients of the funding for the purchase of conservation easements and so forth are ecologically significant areas. So these are already included in your community preservation plan, okay? And again, one of the things that could be done with your community preservation plan would be to include the parcels that have now been identified as part of this process with ecological connectivity, so that these could be reviewed and determine whether or not we have additional areas that were not picked up earlier when the community preservation plan was done a few years ago, and so that would be a little bit more involved. This process is, there's probably other things in the town that need to be updated as part of the community preservation plan, but parcels with the ecological connectivity could also be included as those ecologically significant areas identified. And if you recall from the community preservation plan, this is a parcel by parcel basis. So you're drilling down to individual parcels of land. So it does look at a very fine scale of information. So the long-term actions, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because Laura's already covered them. But again, just to reiterate, to work with Hudsonia and Bard College to conduct habitat studies, to adopt a biodiversity overlay zoning district. That would be a little bit more involved. Other towns have done that though, using a very similar approach. Set up and maintain a database of studies completed. So let's say that you have your critical environmental areas identified and you amend the zoning and the subdivision regulations to now include the ecological connectivity as part of the subdivision review process. You're probably going to start to see some studies coming in that are going to give you valuable information on habitats within the town. And so the suggestion is to set up and maintain that database of these studies once they're completed. Increase public and agency awareness of the resource importance. That's one of the things that the critical environmental areas do. Simply by designating these areas as critical environmental area, it does raise the public awareness and understanding of what a critical environmental area is, that these areas have an intrinsic value, as Laura discussed. There were a number of forestry management actions, the pinch points, and I don't know whether or not you want to talk about pinch points or not, what they mean, so everybody has a good understanding.
Well, just that idea where the linkages get so narrow that it seems like, it's possible that with any further encroachment into that area, it would pinch off that connection. So the idea being that if you prioritize those and think about restoring a little bit more broader connectivity there, you won't lose that opportunity for maintaining connectivity.
And the final one is sort of related to that too, identify specific roadways for habitat mitigation strategies, because there may be barriers to wildlife movements that are introduced when roads are constructed, when roads are rebuilt, and so forth. So that would be to identify specific roadways where it's important to maintain that connectivity for wildlife. So I think that's pretty much it in terms of the implementation, and I guess we'll just throw it open to questions now.
Yeah, and I also wanted to just add, because I know that Ted reviewed, as did I, a number of action ideas, and I just wanted to remind the town board and the community that, with the estuary program, when we partner with municipalities, we're in it for the long haul too. So in terms of, helping increase awareness, for example, we're available to, meet with the planning board if that's useful. We have funding opportunities. Our estuary grants are due in mid-June, and there's a whole community stewardship category, which is focusing on things like open space planning and natural resource inventories at the municipal level. So in terms of any technical assistance, we also have some opportunity to cover some of Ted's time as part of this project as we kind of see it toward the finish line, or one of the finish lines. So I just wanted you to know that it's not a kind of situation where we're saying, well, here's the report, good luck with that. We're definitely, we want to be engaged with you moving forward, so.
Okay, I guess we can lead off with board questions, if you have any. I have just one, and it has only just come up in my mind. When we talk about overlay zoning districts, often we talk about an amount of quantity of land, a minimum amount of land that would be talked about to be designated. Is there such a thing? Are we talking about 10 acres is something that is large enough to be considered, or does it need to be 20 acres or 50 acres? Do you know what I'm saying?
For an overlay zone?
For an overlay, an overlay zone, for a biodiversity overlay zone. What is I guess I would ask the minimum amount of acreage that would have a positive effect?
Well,
do we know that?
Yeah, I guess that's a scientific answer to a certain extent. I mean, the answer from a planning standpoint is that an overlay district is something that is created on a map that addresses the specific resource that's found on the map. So whether or not an area of particular ecological importance is 2 acres or 200 acres, what's relevant is that the area be properly identified, and that the regulations or the requirements for what happens within that area that's been identified are properly articulated and have been fully vetted with public review and public hearings and everything else to ensure that what you're doing now in the way of any amendments is carrying out what people want to see and what's best for the town. But it really, I think the science behind it is what Cornell developed as part of the model. And I think, we would probably be looking to the mapping that was done as part of this to form the basis for that overlay district.
So it'd be too early to tell.
I think it's too early to tell at this point.
And it's possible that the stakeholder group might want to reconvene at some point too, to look at the maps again more closely.
Yeah.
When we move, if there's agreement that something like a CEA is a great idea, or an overlay zone, then we could look and start talking about, okay, those areas that were shown in purple that are primary and secondary linkage areas, what do those mean in reality on the ground, and how do they relate to maybe some of the other plans that you have already in place, or and so forth. And where again, it's like finding those gaps in protection. One of the maps that AKRF produced for the final report showed, I think like a lot of the areas that maybe are already captured by your wetland protection or your stream protection stream protections that are in place. And we found a lot of linkages were captured by that, but perhaps if there was a broader buffer, it would capture even more of the linkage areas. So it's finding those kind of gaps that might fill in the pieces, and then from that, I think identifying what are the tools that are most would be most meaningful and effective. And
I think you looked at the parcels that are already under easement and found that covers a lot of the areas already.
Exactly, yeah. They use, I think AKRF included a whole different continuum of kind of levels of protection, all the way down to maybe municipal land that's used for operations or something like that. So which might not necessarily be protected in quality for connectivity, but for right now, it's not vulnerable to a large-scale development, for example. And one comment I also wanted to make that I was glad Ted alluded to in the beginning is that map of linkages isn't suggesting this is like a no-build zone. That's not what so the idea is that all these different land use planning tools can be incorporated to try to soften the impacts so that there maintains what we call permeability, so that while it can still move across the landscape, perhaps by situating the development a little bit differently or making some adjustments to what's proposed. And it's just being mindful that this is yet another part of our kind of ecological health, and that if we're not incorporating into our planning, we're going to lose that aspect.
With the map that we have from Cornell, is that sufficient to move ahead with some of these ideas, or?
Yes, but I think let's do it, together, and I don't want to just leave you with that map. And I'll work with Suzanne. Jason has moved on to, another position with Cornell, but Suzanne and I could work together to make sure that you have a map that's ready to go when you are. Yeah.
I think it's a great idea, and we should definitely think about it. But in some ways, it could be in conflict with our present conservation development plan, because that's conserving farmland, and open farmland is not necessarily a good ecological corridor. What might be a good ecological corridor could be the very poorer farmland on the farm that at the present time our zoning is recommending that's where the building would go. So we would definitely have to take this into conjunction and possibly modify that, or what is allowed, or where they might go, because there could be a narrow band, and that could be the whole place that would be taken up with a conservation subdivision.
Absolutely. We're not suggesting this is going to now trump all the work you've done on those other kinds of plans and priorities.
We should definitely be thinking about that when we do that. But it might have to be a little give and take both ways in order to allow something like that.
And farmland is part of kind of that ecological fabric that kind of maintains connectivity, because in many, for some species anyway, it's a lot easier to move across farmland than it is, for example, a large shopping parking lot, depending on the species. Some are more vulnerable.
Right, but some species much prefer a bush or forest.
Right. And there might be things like hedgerows that can kind of help.
Not plowed fields.
Exactly, right. And I wanted to also comment on the critical environmental area discussion, because later on you talked about the resource analysis map that Red Hook developed, and that it's really up to the project sponsor to identify some of those important resources. I would imagine having a critical environmental area that reflected some of this would take the burden off the applicant and actually let the town be proactive about saying these are the areas that are important, and then those automatically end up on that resource map. So that's another benefit. And I know that the town of Hyde Park took some ecological information we gave them and developed critical environmental areas based on just important habitat. And if you're interested in seeing what they developed to document it, I'd be happy to share that with you as an example.
One of the things I noticed, and paying attention while you were developing this plan, is that many of these connectivity avenues run from the town to the village of Tivoli in particular. Much more so in Tivoli than in Red Hook. Red Hook has much denser development, but the connectivity through Tivoli is very important. It seems to me we have to work constructively with the village to continue to remain, that they remain open and active and available for this. If we shut them down, my yard happens to be in the middle of one of them.
I absolutely a great, and that's a point I usually make in every presentation, that natural systems don't stop at political boundaries or parcel boundaries or site plan boundaries. And so I'm so glad you made the point, because I forgot to, that yeah, certainly it was wonderful that there was intermunicipal cooperation on this project, and hopefully that will continue moving forward.
And, of course, the community preservation plan was inclusive of both villages, but certainly, in terms of zoning, your zoning boundaries and your zoning districts, and if you did an overlay district or any other changes, it's going to change. That's going to stop right at the Tivoli boundary or the Red Hook boundary, and so that would be a benefit, I think, to also talk to the villages about cooperating on that.
Some of the villages would prefer that our maps didn't show a blank spot with the villages on it.
Right, that was feedback we got. They liked these maps because they didn't have blank spots in them. Right?
We have a lot of CAC members, maybe they have some questions.
The linkages are primarily mature forest and waterways. That's what I'm kind of getting from the...
There was emphasis, so the way the model was developed, it looked at land cover, and I'm going to not do as good of a job as the Cornell scientists who worked on this, but it looked at land cover in categories like, wetlands, forests, different kinds of agricultural land. There was, developed, different degrees of developed land. And each of those units on the map were given different values based on what's called resistance. Like how resistant would it be for a species, which we weren't modeling this based on any particular species needs, but in general, for movement across the landscape, it would be easier to move across a forest and wetland, for example, than pavement, right? So those would be the two kind of, ends of the spectrum. And things were given points, again, also depending on the relationship of where they were spatially. So farmland might have been given a particular value, but farmland that was adjacent to forest was given a higher value than the farmland that was out in the open. So all of those kinds of factors were put into play when this model was run, so that the model would try to find, I believe, the shortest distance as well as the least resistant pathway. And it was kind of a combination of those two factors. What's the quickest way to get from point A to point B, but what's the path of least resistance? And it's actually similar to when you build a trail system for people to move about, to recreate. You're trying to get them maybe from this parking lot to this viewpoint, but you can't just go straight through because they need to be able to maybe go on switchbacks, or you think about the needs of the person that's hiking. So this model kind of took into account those two ideas. It was connecting primarily. It was connecting large forest patches. So those are the two pieces of the model. You have to say, what are we connecting? And in this case, it was forest patches, and I'm just forgetting the value. They were over 200 acres. So any forest patches in the town and village that was over 200 acres was considered a core. And then the model was designed to try to link between those core forest patches, and it generated those paths of least resistance that were the shortest distances. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, great, yeah. And one thing, and so the reason why the model, I was saying it's not really just a static map, is because you can make slight adjustments to different things in the model and get slightly different outcomes. So what Jason did was he ran the model with four different ways, and to look and see how different changes would result in different outcomes. And then the map that showed kind of what he called primary and secondary linkages, I think represented where there was the most agreement amongst those different models. So where was there the greatest amount of overlap? So that would build kind of confidence in it.
So the last one, identify specific roadways for habitat mitigation strategies. Was there some sort of actual design of the roads that you're recommending that would be different for the curbing?
Curbing is one, like the Cape Cod curbs that, so you don't provide a barrier for wildlife movements.
For smaller wildlife, in particular, amphibians and some reptiles. A curb is like the Great Wall of China. When they hit it, they can't get over it. And what they'll do is they'll follow it along until they usually hit a storm drain, and then they fall, and then that's it. So in areas where that there's good forest habitat maybe, or there's movement of certain species, that would be a situation. And if a new development is going in there, that Cape Cod kind of angled curbing is what's recommended, or no curbing.
And that's in the long term because it's complicated to make those changes?
Well, Oh, you mean to mitigate what's there now?
Or to just, change a standard for when we want to do something differently going forward?
Oh, that's a good question for you.
Well, that's a good question. Because I'm thinking now, why was that
Worded the way
not
it was?
something that was, but why was it left to, well, it's actually an ongoing action, so it's not just long-term.
Right.
So I think if you look at it from that standpoint, this was one of the things that was recommended to begin to look at right away.
And what it said specifically in this list of recommendations was use mapping to identify areas where mitigation strategies should be used for new roads and highway improvements. It didn't say anything about mitigating existing, but I'm sure that's, that would be an opportunity as well.
Yeah.
And, and thanks to the data that you and other volunteers have been collecting with regard to amphibians, you're starting to know where some of those areas are. And certainly there's probably other groups of animals that would be something to consider as well. That's just one project and one set of forest amphibians, but there could be turtle situations in town I don't know enough about. That's the kind of wildlife-specific stuff that we weren't able to study in the scope of this project, but that's a great thing for local, residents in the CAC and others with knowledge of the town to think about. We didn't even get into aquatic connectivity. We were talking about terrestrial connectivity here, but some of my colleagues have been working with communities who are interested in looking at their culverts to see, when you have a perched culvert, for example, in a stream, a species like a wood turtle, which I know you have in Red Hook, can't necessarily navigate a culvert that's so high that the water's flowing out instead of flowing at level with the stream. And certainly that would impact fish as well. And I know that you have some good fish, right? In Red Hook. So that's and that's something else, again, that was of interest at some point. I could, connect you to one of my colleagues that's been working with municipalities on culvert issues in the Hudson Valley too. There's been CACs doing culvert surveys to figure out where there are good culverts, bad culverts, because not only is it an issue for fish and other aquatic species, but it's also an issue for, with climate change and intense storms. Wrong-sized culverts can't accommodate the heavy flows of big storms, and they'll often cause a lot of flooding and property damage. So again, that resiliency idea, it's resilient for wildlife, is also often resilient for human communities. So that's, looking at culverts is something that the estuary program just started doing a couple of years ago with Hudson Valley communities.
It's been done here.
What's that?
It's been done here in Saukville.
Oh, good. Yeah, great. Sorry, and I can't keep track of every project everywhere.
Maybe you touched on this in the very beginning, which I missed, but I think parks are really important in towns, and it's a chance that a lot of people running, I say running and walking and biking, but they really don't have a chance to stop and look at the beautiful environment around them. And there's a little park in Rhinebeck I saw recently. People can sit down on a bench and they're surrounded by a very natural environment. I think there needs to be more of that kind of connectivity where people can have a beautiful little place, look at over the Hudson River, for example, where these big oil containers used to be down in Barrytown. That would be a beautiful little park, and people could stop there, look at the water, and rejuvenate. I think when people get too far disconnected from this, they come up with things like creating chickens with no feathers, which I saw on Facebook recently, and I think that's really horrible. The poor little chickens had no feathers. So I think that they need to be surrounded by nature and understand how that works, how it works well. So is there a place for little parks here and there?
Well, that's a good question for your town board, I think, too. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that question, but I mean, what I can say about that is absolutely. The more people can connect to nature, the more they'll recognize that living in some sort of balance is important. But the other side of that, which may also appeal to town leaders, is there's economic benefits to having recreational opportunities in a community, and connectivity of our natural areas and habitats often lends itself to trails. Because trails require connectivity, and I'm so fortunate where I live in Ulster County, there's been so much effort to connect rail trails at least, and and make sure there are connections between different rail trails, and that's been a big economic driver. So people like getting out in nature. It's good for health and well-being,
And not just zipping through it.
but certainly so foot trails, and places to stop and reflect are really important. So I would think that kind of thinking is compatible with these sorts of projects as well. But in terms of what you got locally, that's up to your town planner and town board.
Town board.
Town board, yeah, right.
We have a traditional neighborhood area where there is a substantial development about to happen, and about half of it will result in a preserved, it's a wetland area, it'll be preserved as a wetland, and it will have some recreational aspects of it, such as seating and trails and whatever. I think Brenda's been following up on that, haven't you?
Yes, and I think the CAC and the Trails Committee and the Rec Committee and all are going to be meeting with the developer to discuss a trail there. And actually, it's the site of the old Hucklebush Rail Trail, so the developer has expressed the willingness to do something, you know, a historic marker, plus also perhaps an easement, a trail easement. So, Laura, would the amphibian migration data that the volunteers here have been collecting, is that going to be incorporated into this?
I'll certainly make it available. I was fortunate that I had a SUNY New Paltz intern last semester helping me still work with all that data, but we're trying to get it ready to share with all the communities that have been involved. So, but yeah, that could certainly be added to it. The level of that data is different from the model, but it's like another tool that could be thought about when you're coming up with your next steps. So, yeah, yep.
I mean, I can't speak for the planning board, but I would think that they would definitely want to meet with you.
Great.
Or be receptive.
Okay.
I think that's up to them.
Yeah.
So can you envision next steps maybe being another stakeholder meeting to examine recommendations and seeing what might be feasible in our town, or what kind of next steps?
I think that would be the next step.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, we could do what we did in the past and do a kind of scheduling poll of the stakeholder group, and I mean, because really, you know, I mean, I think we're going to be interested in hearing from the town board, you know, about what the willingness is for some of these recommendations. But based on that, when we know that, you know, that would give us some foundation for kind of taking the next steps. Yeah.
It strikes me that because so much farmland here in Red Hook has been preserved, that because of the nature of farming, having been on a tractor and mowing in a field and mowing down nests of birds and so forth, you know, it strikes me that farming can be a conflict with biodiversity and connectivity. How do you think about that?
And I can say I can share my personal experience with when I used to monitor Blanding's turtles in Dutchess County for the Nature Conservancy, and a lot of the turtles that were in this preserved wetland would go off to private land to nest. And when you know, for a turtle, when they rose up on this nice exposed plowed field in the sun, it seemed like a great place to lay eggs. And then of course they would get shaded by corn. We were moving them. We were actually moving them and relocating them back to the preserve, the nest, to try to get them to survive. But so yeah, so that's, I mean, there's for certain species, yes, that's true. There's other, you know, I know in a lot of, I don't know if this is true for Red Hook, but in Dutchess County, I know there's a lot of hay fields. And, you know, there's been management strategies developed to try to, if the landowner is willing and can afford to adjust the mowing schedule, there's mowing schedules that can be altered to try to accommodate at least one round of nesting, you know, in the season.
But it's complicated.
It's complicated for sure. Yeah.
At one point, one of you said it's quite simple, and throughout this, I was thinking it really isn't very simple. I don't think.
No, I think it's very complex.
Yeah.
I think anything involving land use is very complex, and certainly when you throw in, this is pretty emerging. You know, this is emerging science. We're still trying to understand because we don't know exactly how ecological communities are going to respond to climate change. You know, we have a sense of that, and it's kind of like, you know, it's planning for what we anticipate to happen in hopes that we're going to maintain the biodiversity that we have and not end up, you know, making it even harder for it to survive the, you know, environmental and climate change. But no, I think it's very complex. And
so where are we in identifying where we are? identifying our resources. Are we halfway there? Are we almost there?
In terms of the model,
Uh-huh.
I would say the model is, I'd say 85% there. That's ready to go. It's really, and it'll enable, if we have an idea of where you want to go with it, whether it's thinking about a critical environmental area or if it's thinking about zoning where you need a real good sense of spatially where things are, we'll make sure the map is ready to go for that purpose. And again, to work with a stakeholder group to acknowledge this is what it represents. It's not hard and fast lines, but it gives you a general sense of where could there be flow that you would want to try to preserve through different innovative, approaches. And like I said, it doesn't mean we're saying get easements on all of it. It's recognizing some of it's protected already, where there are vulnerable spots. That's the kind of analysis we didn't have time to do. And that's analysis that would involve the stakeholders because they know the town better. But I think the tool is really ready to go, and the stakeholders do a wonderful job of identifying opportunities that exist already with the planning, the audit of the planning tools that Green Plan did. That was really useful. So it's really just hearing back at some point, of what the interests are of the community.
I think your thought of recalling the stakeholders committing to have another go and maybe asking planning board if they would be interested in a session.
Presentation.
Yeah.
We did have planning board representation, but I think one town planning board member came very regularly.
Maybe if the planning board has a light agenda.
Yeah,
one
that's
night,
what I was thinking. If they would be willing to give, give a half an hour to their agenda some night. And I can't speak for them. Typically for us, July and August are somewhat slower months than they are the rest of the year. But that's just because we get lazy in July and August, and maybe they get more ambitious. I'm not sure.
It might also depend on applications.
Yeah.
So.
A lot of it for planning has to do with the applicants
Right.
and how many are before them, right?
Right, and so...
So you might want to contact the chair and see if you can schedule something, if there is such a thing as a slow
or a workshop meeting or something.
Yeah, that would be great.
And perhaps then the stakeholder group could look back at what these actions were and maybe propose something to the town board.
I think that's a good
think that would be
approach. Like you said, we didn't identify the most vulnerable areas because we didn't have time to go to the parcel
Right.
level. So I think maybe once the town board understands what the risk is or what the vulnerable areas are, that then we could better make a decision.
Yeah, and if the stakeholder group doesn't feel that the resource of time is available to go through that process too. The critical environmental area approach, again, it's just raising awareness of the linkage network and providing opportunity to talk about. And at that point, well, what is this parcel area? What's already protected? If something is proposed in the vicinity of or in the linkage, it gives a chance to talk about it at that point. And I generally say it's not good to wait till you're at the site plan level to talk about those sorts of priorities, but the critical environmental area would be an opportunity to take that first step if there wasn't time right now for the stakeholders to get into the nitty-gritty of the parcel level analysis. So that's something we can kind of talk about with the stakeholder group and find out what does it look like for everybody's schedules, how much time can people put into this. And
creating something like a storehouse of the assessments as they're done for various developments that really doesn't take town board action. It's just a procedure.
Yeah.
And we have some of that data already.
And I don't know if Lori, you want to mention too that you've already started doing some mapping, right?
Are you talking about the vernal pool
Yeah.
stuff? Yeah, we did a little bit with our students as part of their citizen science.
Right.
And that's
And is there intent to continue with the vernal pool mapping, or?
I think we could repeat it again next year.
Yeah. So that also doesn't require town board action to start improving the kind of the resource mapping that you might need.
Now, throughout this, you mentioned that the planning board, it was mentioned over and over and over again, that the planning board needs to consider these connectivity areas. Consider these areas, hold them on high priority, consider. Is there a resource out there that gives them like a Chinese menu of what the BMP should be to consider those areas when you have a development? Like, how are they going to know what to do? I mean,
Right.
you really can't rely on the developer to create what that
Right.
protection is, because they're going to create their own protection however they see fit. So, I mean, is there a resource out there to hand to a planning board member to say, okay, if you have these connectivity areas, whether it be culverts and road design, consider sinking the culverts and keeping them, below water level, is there that resource there so they know kind of what to do?
Right, no, and that would be that's an excellent question, and that's part of the kind of outreach to the planning board and kind of doing some training, and we could work on putting something like that together. But I mean, because it's not something that should be just left up to folks without having a little bit of training. So we could definitely provide some of that. Yeah, great. And the one thing that there is, which may be useful, is there's been a lot of connectivity planning being done up in the Adirondacks, and the Wildlife Conservation Society put together a document called Protecting Wildlife Connectivity Through Land Use Planning, BMPs, and the Role of Conservation Development. And this was more looking at conservation development, but if that ends up becoming a policy approach, they did a whole review of various municipalities and what parts of the codes were particularly useful. So we'll help kind of pull all that together. A good question. I mean, it's my to-do list.
Do you have a large version of the map that you had up there?
Not yet, but that's something that we'll work on.
It seems to me
That
that
would be
would
helpful.
Yeah, sure.
a great start, I think.
Well, and we also want to be able to get the GIS files in shape that we can share those with, I guess, Green Plan or, whoever has GIS capacity in the community.
That would be great to have with them in conjunction with the map.
Yep, and certainly as a PDF.
Do each of the town board members have a digital copy of the
Report?
Because if you have that, if you have the, because maybe if you have that, then what you could do is you could zero in on the map.
Right.
That's right.
If it's on your screen.
And what's great about PDF maps, if you're not aware of this, there's actually a function that enables you, depending on the way the map is structured, to turn layers on and off, much like you can in GIS. I wish I had an example I would show you right now, but it's a great function that I was happy to teach. My geography intern wasn't even aware that. They had never been taught that you can produce PDFs from a GIS map that has the ability to turn off the road layer, turn on the road layer, turn off the water. And it really enables you to see things more closely. It's really great. So Brenda, I don't have everybody's email address, but if I send the digital copy to you, would you forward it? Sure. Okay.
Any other questions from up here? It's been very interesting to hear people's concerns and interests. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for your time. You're welcome.
Thank you.
And thanks for everybody for coming. Yeah.